On behalf of the Office of Public Engagement at Memorial University, I'd like to welcome you to the fifth installment in our Just Ask series. Just Ask is a regular feature of the Tandem, which is the Office of Public Engagement's online newsletter. You can find us at mun.ca/publicengagement/tandem. My name is Andreae Callanan. I'm a doctoral student here at Memorial and a program support with the Office of Public Engagement, and I'm delighted to be speaking with Dr. Anne Burke. Dr. Burke is a professor in literacy education and digital early learning at Memorial's Faculty of Education, and she's the project lead for the faculty's Discovery Play Center. Dr. Burke's projects have been supported by grants from the Office of Public Engagement, from the Department of Education of Newfoundland and Labrador, and from SSHRC, Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council. And recently, Dr. Burke has used her expertise to develop some highly successful public engagement projects with the Rooms here in St. John's, Newfoundland and Labrador. And we're going to hear about that partnership today. Dr. Burke, thank you so much for joining me.
Oh, thank you so much for having me. It's a pleasure to be here and to talk about the work that I've been doing, research as well, mostly public engagement when we look at our partnership with the Rooms with the Faculty of Education. So thank you again.
I would love for you to begin with talking about these projects you've been involved in with the Rooms, and also for people who are watching from elsewhere who aren't familiar with the Rooms, what that institution is and what it means to the province and to the people here.
Well, thanks very much. The Rooms, it's just the most fantastic, beautiful, fabulous place that really encapsulates Newfoundland and Labrador culture. So the Rooms actually was created over 10 years ago. It's called the Rooms because it gathers together a gallery, archives, and museums, and it represents the people of Newfoundland, their culture, represented through a number of objects, art gallery, as well as archives that have been collected since the province was created in 1949. The collection is extensive. The Rooms has an international reputation as one of the places when we look at art galleries and museums and archives is a place to go because it's creative, presentation in the way that things are exhibited. As well as the programming, which is something that I've been able to avail for research and to bring together different community groups. A lot of my work is in teaching classrooms and with research, but a lot of our research is very global right now and looking at children's rights in education, as well as ways in which we can, advocate for children, especially newcomer children. We do have a very changing global population, and we're really interested in thinking about how do we get children to start to create art, but also expressing their opinion and taking agency for what we're doing. When I start thinking about what is it that I want, I'm looking at equity and well-being. So that's something, but a lot of it stems from collaborative inquiry. So it's being able to work with your partner and be able to sit down and say, what is it that you're curious about? And that's the question I always ask. And I always come back to that question because I remember, my first interview as a teacher, and the principal said to me, so what are you curious about, Anne Burke? And I thought, I was expecting him to say, how would you teach reading? Or how is playful learning a part of what you do? And I realized that in order for children to grow, they have to be curious and they have to have questions. And that's how we really get them to take agency.
I'd love to hear about some of the specific projects and what those have looked like and who they have involved in the community.
So makerspaces, actually this started with my work, international work in a project called Makey. And the Makey project was a Horizons grant with over 12 other countries. And the Makey project was looking at what we call making, the idea with early childhood children, young children, and their creative spirit in making, but also bringing focus to young children and looking at what we would call STEM education. So science, technology, engineering, we put in the arts because it is the Rooms, and mathematic education. And part of that project was partnership with cultural institutions such as the Rooms, Botanical Gardens, the Geo Center, and community groups. So that's how my work began. In working with the rooms, we created an MOU, which was an understanding that we together would partner on a number of, I guess, maker fairs is what we call them. And those opportunities were really brought in a lot of artists within the communities, but also schools, teachers, and community together. So it was about Canadian and international researchers coming together to talk about what that meant for preschool children, and how I think for the rooms was really to create sustainable models of how maker spaces can provide opportunities for the rooms to reach other communities. So over, I guess, a period of 3 years, we've hosted a number of maker fairs at the rooms. And I think, Andrea, you did mention that you've probably attended a couple of those. So the rooms is very innovative. It offers a lot of programming, public programming for children just coming on the weekends, but also through schools. And the Maker Fair was one of those projects. So the first one that we did decide that we would host, and we worked together in putting that together, you know, for an evening for not just schools, but for the public, was called Full Steam Ahead. And it was about looking at how we could connect families, children, schools, with the public, as well as the Department of Education and artists. And what we did was the makerspace consists of pop-up tables with experts working at each table. And what was really important about this particular one is that we focused on local Newfoundland culture. So we had, I guess, artists working in the area of net making, knotting, textiles, rug cooking, significant crafts that really represented our local culture, which was important. But I think for me and for Anne, it was really important, and Picard Vandering, who is the lead for Maker Fair at the rooms, was looking at how the project reinforced cultural making. And that children were allowed to reimagine their local landscapes in the way that they could see or perceive where they lived.
How have you benefited? How's your research benefited from that relationship? Obviously, it gives you a reach, an audience. What has that experience done for you as a researcher?
Well, for me, a lot of my research is international. So, I mean, I'm working with people who are working with different cultural institutions. So it's been very beneficial to be able to highlight Newfoundland and Labrador culture, as well as to celebrate our newcomer culture. And, you know, that's part of what the focus has been. I love how Anne and I, when we first talked about why this research is important, is because it's around making narratives. It's about sharing stories. And sharing stories in a way that people begin to understand the purpose of the research. So this was one of the things that has always been sort of allowing for us to bring forth. With the Makey project in particular, it did actually, I guess, spawn an international conference that came with researchers internationally to come and meet at the rooms and have dialogue and conversations around cultural making. So it was a way for us to talk about that and to be able to bridge over. The other thing that it does, it also has allowed for, you know, the rooms to see what is going on in other spaces, you know, and how they're addressing place and narrative. So, you know, all of these are very important. Another important rooms event was the celebrating of Indigenous culture, and that was sort of looking at urban landscapes through skateboarding. And, you know, that project was one that brought in partners First Light. And with the partnership in First Light, of course, they had a live skateboard pike that was installed into the rooms. And it allowed for youth from First Light to come and become artists to do, like, you know, the entry point of the turnpike. You know, so we actually had live skateboarding going on and all of this youth visiting the rooms, which was kind of different. I mean, the rooms at one point people don't really mention, but I mean, skateboarders have always been around the rooms. This was the first time they actually were in the rooms. This goes back into literacy. It's like, Anne, you're a literacy researcher. How does this really come into your work? Well, literacy is not just about reading and writing. Literacy is very much about the practice of how we live. Okay, so reading and writing allows for that communication for us to do these things. But when we look at literacy as a greater understanding, it's really about how you live your life. That's essentially what it is.
This is fantastic. What I love so much about these projects you're describing is so often we think of museums and galleries, like you said, as a sort of a space that we're not all welcome in necessarily, right? We think of them as being sort of quiet and serious, and you stand around and you make observations and you quietly go on to the next spot. But these projects are noisy and jubilant. I mean, you can't skateboard quietly, right? These are active and vibrant and dynamic projects with children talking over each other. And that experience, I can imagine, for the people who are participating must be really empowering and engaging. But I think also for perhaps the people who have a more traditional notion, a more, academic in quotes notion of how these spaces are meant to be used, must be really challenging in some ways and exciting, but also, oh, it's awfully noisy for a gallery, or it's awfully noisy for a museum. And I'm wondering about, especially for researchers who are looking into how to develop these kinds of relationships, what have the challenges been of creating these spaces, of developing these partnerships? I mean, the Rooms is a formidable institution. It's got a system of governance that is different from what we're used to at the university. There are relationships, but then there are models that are different. What have those challenges been, and what have you learned from them, and how have you worked around them?
Oh, it's interesting because the Rooms is, as you've said, it's a very complicated structure, as well as a governance there that is something that you have to really understand and be very respectful of, and be reciprocal to understanding, very negotiated. So, I mean, you're looking at a building with three separate, an archives, a gallery, as well as a museum that work together, but in many ways their exhibit and spaces are separate. So it's something that can be quite complicated. In talking with Anne, and this is something too, I mean, like Rooms, the gallery spaces and museums globally have really changed. We're looking at what we call living exhibits now, where it's about the experience itself and trying to find ways. I mean, I think that in order for them to generate larger audiences and have audiences return, is that exhibits can no longer be static. Okay, so they have to be ever changing, and they have to address, what changes and what are the challenges within our global world, as well as bring in opportunities for them to feel that they're a part of that. Building a relationship with the Rooms, well, I mean, their mission is really about addressing culture and celebrating culture and identity in Newfoundland and Labrador, but not necessarily just Newfoundland and Labrador identity. I mean, a visit to the Rooms, at the time when I began, was that it wasn't as multicultural or diverse as they wanted it to be, but I've seen it really change within the last 2 to 3 years as a result, of many things going on, and partially the Maker Faire, where we've had sort of numerous voices come forth. Much of our work, again, is very much about looking at how that we can make these spaces more accessible. So the Rooms is now looking at just not in particular, I mean, my work has been about introducing them to teachers, pedagogy, and students and children and young children's programming is what we've been focused on. But they're now looking at how can we bring programs in that are more universal, right? So for them, you really need to see that their audience and the people who participate are very much just as diverse as the collections that they bring in. And also the thing about the Rooms too is that with all gallery spaces and museums is that they often curate years in advance. So what you do bring has to be something that is flexible, is that something that addresses the mandate that they have, but can pivot very quickly, as we did with the pandemic. So it's got to be something that allows, they're interested in having more people visit the space, but they also want the space to be accessible more. So online, thinking about also to all peoples within our province. So that was something that we wanted this, and also this particular, I guess, model of the Maker Faire can actually be created in other spaces. And that was really important to us. So it's not a one-off. It's one of those things where if you're going to go into partnership with them, you have to be, very receptive. You have to understand they have multiple partners. It's not just them. It's a conversation that takes place with you, that takes place with different curators, different folks that they deal with and stakeholders. So it's very vibrant. The conversation is always very engaging, but there takes a lot of negotiation as well. So, and in a positive way too. You learn much, lots and lots of different things about how institutions such as this struggle, but also the challenges that they have, but also how they've overcome those and how they've been quite successful.
I can only imagine how fascinating and engaging these conversations must be. And it certainly seems like it's well worth the effort to have been putting the time into building these relationships, into imagining in the long term what these relationships can look like and what these projects can look like. I'm going to thank you so much for this, Dr. Burke, for speaking with me today. You have provided so much valuable insight into your work and also into what goes on behind the scenes at some of these cultural institutions that we love so much, because so many of us in the public benefit from these projects and we have no idea how they happen and what goes into them. And I think we've got a little glimpse of that now. So thank you so much for speaking with me. And on behalf of the Office of Public Engagement at Memorial University, it's been a delight to talk to you.
Thank you. It's been delightful to talk to you. And I thank you on behalf of myself as well as the rooms. We always are delighted to talk about our work and make more connections.